Welcome back, Action Researchers. We are ready to jump into Session 3 information for the course, so we are traveling along at a good clip. Let's take a quick second to review some of the information from Session 2. So in Session 2, you completed the article Jigsaw, and thank you for your great work in that and reading through some of the comments and reflections from those that read the articles, as well as the networking in that others did as they reviewed the articles they did not read but got to see the feedback from their peers in the class. I was really energized by the amount of dialogue that you guys were having. Some of the things that really stood out to me was the realization that action research can be a really empowering process where it can give you the opportunity to collect data to bring about change for things that could be something that might have been prohibitive in the past because we didn't really have the data to back up why we were asking to make changes at the classroom level if we didn't have the autonomy to do so. So really take it as an opportunity for what we're doing to open the door for additional communication and dialogue between your administrators and your colleagues, and all for the support of students. So I won't belabor the point, but thank you for your great work in digging into some of the pieces I laid out for you on action research in general as a tool. You also completed the revision of action research questions. In doing so, there were really no right or wrong answers. If you really put a wholehearted attempt at making those questions improved over what they had started at that starting point, I did provide you some feedback for some ways that I thought they could be amended as well. So hopefully no questions from that, but if you do have any lingering questions, please reach out to me. You also read Mertler Chapter 3, which will be a good stair step into what we're getting ready to do in Session 3 this week. And so I'm going to get into that a little bit, but specifically in Mertler Chapter 3, a lot of good information, but one of the key pieces is the review of literature, and Mertler starts to talk about how to structure that component of your project, which will be the second section after the introduction that we'll start to craft this week. So this week will be a push week to try and get that in. So just take a deep breath and know that it is a work in progress, and we will have a draft produced by the end of the week. But it will not be final. It will be in draft format when you turn it into me. So just wanted you to note that Mertler Chapter 3, I believe right around page 74, 75 for reference point to go back and take a look at that again this week. And then you completed 2 research article abstracts. At the point that I am casting this presentation, I did look at all those that had been turned in. The majority were turned in at this point on Sunday, and they looked really, really good. The format was great. They were concise, and they were all that I reviewed at this point were based on research. So well done, and thank you for following the directions and getting into the research databases. This week, just briefly, we are going to be reviewing your plans for research and writing an action research report. Those are the sections of Mertler for Chapter 4 and Chapter 8. I will point out some key pieces in just a moment, but Chapter 4 and Chapter 8 will give you some good information about where we're headed. So Chapter 4 in particular is going to give you a little bit of differentiation on research questions and how to formulate them, as well as how to develop a research plan. And what I really appreciate is Mertler does a nice job of providing a quick overview of the difference between different types of research designs. He talks about qualitative research designs, and within that, case studies or observational studies are in that category. They tend to be more open-ended, so that's something to think about. He also then on page 98 gets into quantitative research designs, and those are more descriptive designs, correlational designs, comparing groups, and more experimental formats. So qualitative tends to be a little bit more open-ended. Quantitative maybe a little bit more specific in the data that we collect and are able to collect. So we'll talk about some different ways to collect data to just kind of get the thinking going before we sign off on this cast this week. You're also going to be tasked with the second item on the screen, finalizing your action research project question. So you need to be thinking about what is the problem statement you're trying to solve in your classroom. And what is the resulting research question that you're going to set up for your action research project? And I asked last week to send me a quick email at my Baker email address and just let me know kind of what you're thinking in terms of your topic. If you have not reached out to me, only a handful of people did contact me, please email me in advance of turning in your draft so we can kind of start to, I can ask you some questions and maybe help you narrow in on your research question. Item 3. This week you're going to be developing draft sections of the action research project, so we're really going to start writing this week. So you're going to develop the introduction, and we'll walk through some criteria of what you need to have in the introduction here in just a minute. You're also going to develop section 2, which is the research support for change. All of this is going to be in one document. You can draft it in a Google Doc and share it with me so that I can comment back and provide feedback. Or I'd ask you to do it in Microsoft Word and share that document with me, and I will use the track changes feature to give you feedback, and you can accept those changes. What we start this week, and I'll say this again, what we start this week, I want you to start one document for your project, and each section is just going to be added on to this single document. So every week when you have a draft due, from this point forward, you're going to build your draft into that single document. I had one student that got so confused a couple semesters ago because he had so many drafts going on. He didn't know which one I had commented on, which one he had amended. It was a mess. So just keep one document for your project from this point on as we begin. And again, these are drafts that are due. It's part of your weekly participation. That's how I will grade them. The only time I take points off is if there has been absolutely no effort or minimal effort in getting the week's work done. So I am pretty forgiving in terms of the format. I'll be working with you to give suggestions if I see ways to improve on APA. If there are mechanical issues, I will give you feedback as best I can, and we'll work together to get your drafts moving each week. But you will get weekly feedback from me in writing. And then the last piece on this slide for this week is research teams. I will start based on what I see in your projects after this week. As we move into week 4, week 5, start to put together maybe some research partners. We're, depending on the size of our cohort, we're pretty small right now. I'll get you some research teams forms so that you will have someone in the next couple of weeks that you'll be able to link up with and maybe, bounce ideas off one another. So that's where we're headed for this week and a little bit beyond. Action research resources in Moodle. You have a couple of different resources that I want to point out in Moodle. I'm going to pop into there. A couple of things for this week. You have the Session 3 screencast, which I'll be updating there in just a minute, so ignore the 2019 information because you'll get an updated version as soon as we're done with this cast. There is a quick review. What I found, it's kind of helpful depending on where you are in your course sequence. If you haven't learned about some of the more research-based instructional strategists, I have just a really short module for you to go through on John Hattie's work. He's done a lot of meta-analysis of effective instructional practices that actually are correlated with a research coefficient on the effect size, so the impact that they have on teaching and learning. So if you're looking at ways to improve instruction, Hattie's research is something that you might get some inspiration or ideas from. I also have a little bit of brief information on Robert Marzano and the Marzano 9 effective strategies for teaching and learning. So you have that as a resource this week. I've provided in the past, at the risk of having formulaic projects that result, I think it helps to see where you're going. So I've provided some sample exemplar projects from previous students that have completed the class, and I'm doing so with their permission. Please note that at one point Baker followed MLA format and we made the switch to APA format a few years ago. So please just be attentive to the format. So you might have some examples, but the reference citations are done with a previous format. But the context and the content of the projects I'm sharing with you are still strong and relevant. So that'll give you an idea of kind of what we're doing here and where we're going with our research projects. So I give that as a resource for you. You'll have assignment 3 due this week, and that's the draft introduction, research-based support, and your reference section. So you'll upload that into the assignment area, and I will have this assignment guide that gives you some support for how we're going to develop that project. So we'll come back to that in just a little bit, but that gives you an idea of what resources are there for you. I think in the last week I provided a PDF document or several PDFs that were posted last week for the Action Research Kansas Professional Development Schools. It's a compendium of pre-service teachers that completed Action Research in their PDS schools with their collaborating teachers. And then Omaha's Classrooms, it's a really great resource. It's a few years dated, but still pertinent. A lot of the instructional strategies that were studied there are still good ones, evidence-based ones, but it'll give you an idea of how different teachers across different grades and content area approach to action research in the Omaha Public Schools. And then we've already talked about the exemplar student projects that I've posted for you. So let's dig in a little bit. I'm going to give you a brief introduction to research methodologies. You won't be researching or you won't be writing about your research methodology yet, but we're going to get into that next week. So I want you to be thinking a little bit ahead. So we're going to activate your thinking around what data sources and what ways you could potentially collect data on what question you're formulating. So I do this to help you as you think about writing your introduction and outlining a statement of your problem and your research question that you want to study. You also need to be thinking about how you're going to study that and if it's going to be realistic in the time that we have and the resources that you're going to have at your disposal given your current teaching situation. So the resources that I'm going to share and some of the information, I'm citing it, it's from Sager's work in a previous textbook. So it's titled Procedures, Instruments, Special Issues, and Ethics around data collection. Excuse me. All right, so we've talked briefly about action research and the traditional research method, but both of what we're doing with whether it's traditional or whether it's action research, really now we're focused on asking questions, observing behaviors, using existing data that may be gathered by others. So think about this, if you have any baseline data that you could utilize to help you know whether or not down the road you've had an impact. That might be data that's been gathered by others. Qualitative versus quantitative data, we're going to talk a little bit about that and I'll give you some examples in a second. And you might even think about shared data collection tools. So an example of a shared data collection tool might be elementary teachers, you might have DIBELS as a universal screening tool. So you might have years of DIBELS data for a learner, and then you're going to progress monitor. That would be a data collection tool that others have used, and you might have a data set that you, that again is gathered by others that you could access to know whether or not how great an impact may be realized based on a reading or a math intervention, depending on how you're using DIBELS and which screener you're utilizing. So just be thinking about that. Attendance data, that would be another piece of existing data and also a shared data collection component over the years that would give maybe learner engagement, a measure of engagement. So be thinking about what existing data and also possibly what shared data collection tools you might be able to access. Another shared data collection tool might be collaboration with a special education teacher or school psychologist, where they do a lot or maybe are more accustomed to doing observational data collection, and they may have some tools that they are already utilizing that they could share with you that might be helpful as you develop your project. So just be thinking again about the collaborative opportunities you may have in your teams or your schools and how they may help you. We will be, as we set up our data collection method, we will be triangulating our data. So part of your project requirement is identifying 3 different ways. So you have 3 legs of a stool for data sources that will help you know whether or not you have made a difference with the change that you've implemented. So at least 3 sources of data. I'll give you an example. When I did my PhD research, I was looking at technology integration to basically close learning gaps for at-risk learners in general education settings. So one of my data sources was a wide range achievement test that I implemented at multiple points in the year. So I had an academic measure One of my measures was classroom observations on the teachers that were integrating technology versus those in similar demographic classrooms that weren't utilizing technology to support project work for students. And my third data source was a classroom observation tool that that actually measured time on task. It measured level of engagement. So I had three distinct measures for knowing whether or not my research question was supported and my intervention was supported. Some of the observation methods, just something to think about that others have used or that would be all right to consider. And I'm going to move the screen a little bit down, so I'm going to go away for a minute and you're going to see just a part of the background. So you've got the opportunity to look at discussions or interactions as an observation method. So elementary teachers might do a morning meeting, or any of us if we're teaching remotely, as we get online with our students. You might be using a discussion, and you might think about just maybe journaling, which also is down here, as a result of that discussion, kind of what your key takeaways were each time. Or I've had teachers that have done a discussion or interaction, a morning meeting with folks, and they video or audio tape so that they could go back and listen to it and actually start to like draw out themes in the discussions over several days or weeks. I've had art teachers that have used photography as a data gathering strategy. I've had a couple that have worked on student agency and support for taking care of their materials, taking care of their workspaces. Art teachers, especially if you're teaching, well, most teachers are teaching section by section by section, they don't have a lot of transition time between classes. So it's important for students to be a part of the responsibility of keeping the classroom up. And so that was a couple of my art teachers in the past that have done projects to try and maintain that cleanliness in the classroom, student responsibility, and they used photography as one of their data measures to know whether or not they were making any headway with students. We mentioned case studies as a good qualitative way, and there's some examples in the Mertler text, so I won't go into a lot of detail. Checklists could be another. Think about if you're observing behaviors or desired behaviors, maybe in terms of implementing something with positive behavioral support, there might be a checklist of things you're looking for that are those on-task behaviors, and you could be marking those and then quantifying those, okay? So there's a lot here that you could get into. Interviews, that would be the last thing that I'll touch on here, or questionnaires or surveys. Those might be good ways where you could get at student responses, and we talked last week about how students can be a part of your data collection. So engaging them in completing questionnaires or surveys, or even in small group or one-on-one interviews, might be good ways of measuring change. So those are just some key things that you could think about in terms of your data collection as possibilities. This next slide, we're going to get into the qualitative versus quantitative. We already talked a little bit about the resource that you have with Mertler, so I won't spend a lot of time in this, but the table basically attempts to kind of summarize qualitative versus quantitative. On the one hand, qualitative, all research ultimately has a qualitative grounding. That's a quote by Campbell. Or Curlinger believes there's no such thing as qualitative data. Everything is either a 1 or a 0. So you can basically take anything, whether it's something open-ended like an interview, and you can still assign a quantitative factor to the number of responses that are alike or themed. So that would be Curlinger's argument versus Campbell's in that example. Qualitative data is in the form of words, pictures, and objects, where data in the quantitative way is in the form of numbers or percentage that could be reported. The subject in a qualitative, individuals' interpretations of events are deemed important, uses participant observation, in-depth interviews, where quantitative may be more precise measurement and analysis, so surveys, questionnaires, and the like would fall into more of that quantitative measurement. So it could be argued that qualitative can be more rich. Sometimes it is time consuming, especially if you're going through interviews and trying to take in individual feedback or observational data. And quantitative tends to be more efficient at times because you're dealing with more known values and contextual details that you don't have to follow up and try and tease out in the example of like using a survey, where there are known responses that will be marked. So data collection tools, again, questionnaires specifically, we'll talk about that for a minute. You can have factual questionnaires. Standardized tests would fall under this more quantitative measurement, where again you're going to have a known quantity that you're going to end up with. You're going to know kind of what the outcome of the data will look like in terms of you may not know the precise numbers, but you're going to know what you're going to be working with in the end. No surprises. Questionnaires on feelings, thoughts, behaviors. You can choose whether or not you want to do that with an open response, which will be a little bit more tedious to go through. You can summarize that in your data analysis as you write your project results, versus asking questions that have a Likert scale, which again can be quantified. So let's talk about that Likert scale. If you're going to do any type of survey or questionnaire and pose that to students or your colleagues, or you may even choose to implement a survey with parents and have parents part of your data collection. I'm just thinking creatively, given COVID, what the opportunities might be for project work. If you give a Likert scale, an example would be, a range from strongly agree, neutral, or no feeling one way or the other, disagree, and strongly disagree. I'd ask you to consider, under the survey research, there's two different camps. You can have an even number or an odd number of responses on your scale. Some argue that if you give an odd number of responses, as in the example that I provided you with 5, then you give people the opportunity to cop out if they really don't have a feeling one way or the other and choose the neutral middle ground. If you choose an even number, then you're forcing people to take a response position. So I don't care which way you do it. I'm just, enlightening you that there is survey methodology out there, and there are some arguments in the field about which way is correct. So you might start to notice as surveys come out, maybe political surveys, election year, whether or not they're asking you to take a stand or whether or not they're providing you a neutral opportunity. So the nice thing about Likert scales, as I said before, it gives you consistency in responses. You may not know going into the questionnaire how people are going to feel, but you're going to know you're going to get consistent responses, and you're going to know how to quantify those for your results. And they are easily quantified. Here's just a few other response examples. You could do some open-ended questions where you could provide a prompt and think about what you're providing and ask yourself, am I clear on what I'm asking for? Because if you're going to do an open-ended thought and you really want to get at a specific response, you want to really kind of tease out what you want to know from learners, you need to provide them an appropriate prompt to get at the focus of what you want to know. You can also do some structured thoughts where you have, again, ability to quantify. So think about how you're going to report your data, and so you would assign a quantifiable number so that when you go to report, like structured response, I think about my homework frequently, often, sometimes, seldom, never, then you could say the average response was a 4 or a 4 on a scale of 1 to 5. So the majority of students felt that they often think about their homework. That's kind of giving you some insight of how you'd report your data when you get to your data analysis. We're going to go on to some of the questionnaire advantages or disadvantages, so things to think about. The advantages, you can ask some open-ended questions, created quickly and easily. The disadvantage when you provide those open-ended questions, again, they can be kind of ambiguous and difficult to work with in terms of the data back. Advantages, they're quick to complete for respondents if you use the questionnaires. The analysis of open-ended takes time. Chance to learn unexpected information is greater when you ask some of the questions through questionnaires and particularly seed in some open-ended questions along with those that are more easily quantified. The challenge with a questionnaire over an interview is you as a data collector can't often ask respondents to clarify their responses, because a lot of times when you're going to do a questionnaire, you want it to be anonymous because you want good data back. You don't want people to have to feel like you're going to judge them by what they're telling you. So you also need to think about that. Do you want your participants identified, or do you want your participants to be completely blind in terms of the data to you? Questions with rating scales can be scored quickly, as we talked about, and if you have questions with rating scales that include 2 or more ideas, the results are unclear. So make sure that as you're asking a question that you're only asking one thing, one topic in that question, because sometimes I've seen some that might have several commas, and that's not going to give you valid data. So if you're going to use a rating scale, you're going to ask a question, make sure you're only asking one question at a time to get good responses. So those are kind of the nuts and bolts of questions and data collection and things you can be thinking about as we move into the project. Interviews can be done one-on-one. They can be class meetings, as I talked about before. You could do focus groups where you pull small groups of students together. And they can be formal, where you structure what you're going to ask and you don't deviate from the script. That's kind of handy, because then you can always track back and you're just, recording the responses, and you don't have to worry about, what was the prompt? I don't remember that. Or they can be informal. Informal sometimes is kind of interesting because you don't know where your participants might take you, and so it gives you a little bit more latitude to kind of flow and maybe gain some greater insight than what you had anticipated. There's some interview advantages or disadvantages. The interview advantages, of course, if you get some responses, you can always probe deeper for clarification. You can build a rapport with the respondents. You can have some help in collecting data with those who can't write thoughts or feelings, especially younger students, kindergarten, first graders. It might be difficult for them to complete surveys, although I've had a lot of teachers utilize, happy, sad, and kind of neutral faces for responses, so they've gotten creative on questionnaires. Data can be gathered via audio tapes or videotapes. And then some of the disadvantages, it is time consuming. We talked briefly in the last slide about anonymity, so you won't have that. And there can be sometimes some fear or anxiety about, having to talk and having to tell or share information that could be sensitive. So you're just going to have to gauge that when you make your decision of how you want to collect your data. I have a lot of people that ask about observational tools. I mentioned that I did classroom observations as one of my measures on my technology research for my PhD. So I share my observation tool. I looked at action frames in a classroom. I looked at the types of questions that were being asked, and I basically just quantified those, and whether or not they were open-ended or closed-ended, because I was looking at critical thinking and how project-based learning was being implemented, and whether or not I did see a difference in how students were participating in the classroom and really had ownership in the classroom. So I looked at who initiated questions, whether it was teacher or whether it was student. And then I also, as I was in the classroom, I recorded the percentage of time that was in each one of the activities, whether time was being spent on classroom management, whether it was a transition between activities, there was individual seat work, whether it was student-centered or teacher-centered. And those are just the rest of the components there. I also looked at whole class, and this is how you can quantify academic engagement. So just kind of my legend, I marked a plus. I did a 5-minute scan of a clock, and every 30 seconds I checked the classroom, and then I marked on a grid. My grid looked like this. Each one of the boxes is a student desk and a student. And so if you take 5 minutes divided by 30, every one of these hash marks represented a 30-minute scan of the clock. So my engagement time on task measurement was only 5 minutes of the observation, and all I had to do every 30 seconds when the clock would sweep is I checked, and I would mark on one of these hash marks whether or not a student was off task or on task. So I would just mark a minus if I saw students that were not on task. And then I would total the total number of on-task behaviors during that observation frame versus off-task, and then I would just divide that by the total number of opportunities, and then that gave me my percentage of on-task versus off-task. So as an example, I may come up with 98% of the students were on task during that 5-minute observation frame, and I can quantify it that way. If you want more information on that, I can do a Zoom and talk through that with anybody that's interested. Documents that we've briefly referenced, I've had teachers that have kept journals and used that as they were implementing a change so that they kind of had an opportunity to formally collect their thoughts along the way of what they were seeing. So they would journal like at the end of an instructional period every day for about 2 to 3 minutes, just kind of writing down how they felt the lesson went with the change that they implemented and so forth. I've had teachers that have implemented a case study approach. Other documents, we talked about school records. You can think about assessment performance, past assessment histories, behavior. If students have had behavior intervention plans, that might be good information to look at. And then grades, attendance, discipline. Those are all existing school records that might be helpful to you in your data collection. We will get more into this as we start to talk about your data analysis, but some things to be thinking about as we start to formulate our project ideas. Your data that you select, you're going to want it to be generalizable and being able to apply it across settings. You're going to want to have it reliable, and that simply is it repeatable within the same population? If you took a measure and tried to collect data on it, and you did it over multiple sections of students, would it be apt to be repeatable in terms of the data that you saw and the results that you said? Would it have some consistency and repeatability? That tells you if it's reliable. And validity doesn't measure what it's supposed to, and I'll help you with validity checks as we get into your data tools. I have a template that you'll complete for me to kind of tell me what you're thinking in each of the measures that you're selecting and whether or not they align with your research question. But validity, one of the best things I can say is it used to be years ago, and I think Mertler references in the text, the mismeasure of man was a text that was out there decades ago, and it used to be thought, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that the size of a person's head in circumference was relative to the size of the brain in intelligence. So that was not a valid measure, but at one point, so that measure lacked validity. So that's an example of validity in your data. So you'll be asked to speak to that at some point when we write our data analysis section. So your research must consider and adhere to all three. So again, these are things to think about, and we'll come back. We're gonna cycle back to it and spiral back. Sharing of relevant research. If you haven't already gone in and reviewed the forum post for the abstracts that were submitted in week 2, do so, because anything that was submitted, if you have a common topic or you see some research that is of interest to you, if it's in the forum and someone located it and wrote an abstract for it, you can use that. You can use that as one of your citations as you start to build your project. So again, that's collaborative. If it's in the forum, it's fair game. You can use it. You don't have to shy away from it because somebody else posted it. Any of the research methods can be applied to your own studies. And then this week you're really getting into further into the research databases through Collins Library. And you're going to be looking for more citations to support your research question and what change you want to bring about for your project. So we're going to get into the assignments for week 3 now. So you're going to review additional action research and traditional research studies on your topic. So that's that Collins Library component. You're looking for research already done that supports the change you want to make. You're going to look at the course syllabus and the action research project rubric and the sample projects posted in session 3 to kind of give you some additional supports as you generate the start of your project this week. You will finalize your topic and your research question. And again, if you haven't emailed me to check in with what you're going to do not wait to send me your introduction where you've already named your research question and your topic without checking in with me first. So do not pass go. You need to send me an email so that we can agree that you're on the right track with your research question. It'll save you some headaches down the road. And then you're going to draft and submit your project. This week you have due the introduction, which will include statement of the problem and your research question. You're basically going to write a narrative where you talk about your learners. You're going to talk about the demographics of your school, your classroom, your community. You're going to talk a little bit about you because you are the teacher researcher. You're going to give some of your background, the number of years you've taught, the number of years in this grade level or content area, your experience, and you're going to then lead into the problem that you really want to try to solve and kind of what you think is behind that. And then you're going to finalize your research question. That is how you set up your introduction to the project. It should be 1 to 2 pages. It should be probably 1.5 to 2 pages by the time you're done with the introduction. Then you're going to go into starting to talk about the research-based support for the change you want to make. That research section is section 2, so you're going to do a page break and start off with research-based support for change as your subheading. And you're going to start to build your case with your 7 citations And you'll get close, but if you don't have all 7 this week, I'll just note it and you'll keep going on it. And those are the 2 components, single document, you will submit into assignment 3 for this week. All right, there is a guide in Moodle. I'm gonna go pop back over there and we're gonna pop that on open. Right here, I try to do guides for you for each component that you will do. So this week, I've bolded the 2 components of the project. You see where we're going. All components are there. By the end of the class, we're going to have all 8 components written. But this week, we're doing 2 and 3. Ignore the abstract. You can't write that until the end because you don't know what your data and your conclusions are. So by the conclusion of 3, the section of the project should include information detailing aspects of the context of the study. So we talked about the setting, your school, your classroom, the participants. A lot of this information can be found in the building report card at KSDE on that link, so you don't need to bother anybody at your school to get the demographics. You can take it straight off of that building report card at KSDE. A description of the current climate or instructional practices. The importance of the study. This is all your introduction. The importance of the study for the education community. A statement of the problem and what you're trying to solve. Who's affected. What's suspected of being the why behind the problem, what's the goal, and a rationale for the change. And then the last piece, clearly state your research question. The question this research hopes to answer is, or however you want to state that. This is a formal research project, so be attentive to formal writing. Avoid using I, me, or my statements. You are the teacher researcher. The problem the teacher researcher hoped to solve was. That's a way you can get around using what I want to solve is. Okay, and then write in past tense throughout. You have multiple sections of this project, and by the time we get to the end and we're writing your results and conclusions, it's going to be natural for you to write in past tense. And what we don't want to have happen, rules of formal writing, we don't want to start in present tense. And then as we work all the way through, then all of a sudden our tense, our verb tense changes midway in this document. That's all going to come together in the end. So write in past tense. And I would encourage you, as you get into the research-based support for change, again, go back and reread Mertler. Chapter 3, page 74, talks about how to organize your review of literature. He talks about how to kind of outline and develop some structure. So you might have 3 or 4 separate components that you build together as an outline. So example, you might be looking at positive behavior supports as something. So you might talk about, the research behind PBIS. You might talk about how teachers utilize PBIS at the classroom level. And then you might talk about how students interpret. So those are 3 different ways within the topic of PBIS that you could organize your research that you're going to report on. So just be thinking about how you structure that, and Mertler gives you some good examples in Chapter 3, as do the exemplar projects that I posted for you. You want, by the end of the research-based support for change, at least 7 unique research citations or references in that section. You need to start to collect those and cite them in the references section, which will be a page break, and that will be the very last component of your project. So start to build those pieces together so that you don't have to wait and try and backtrack to get it done in the end. APA format is followed. Insert a running head, page numbers. If you need an example, I'll pop the Online Writing Lab from Purdue has a sample APA formatted paper on their OWL website, and I'll provide that link in Moodle for you as well. So don't worry too much about the formatting. We'll take a look at that when the draft is submitted. But again, this quick, handy couple-page assignment guide kind of helps you know what you need to be responsible for in this first draft that's due. All right, let's pop back over into screencast mode and our last slide for this week, what's ahead. Session 4, we're going to get into the data analysis. Session 5, you're going to have an opportunity to do some individual and collaborative teamwork. We're going to do a writer's workshop where you're going to exchange your projects with others. So you'll have some peer review opportunity and again, a nice collaborative opportunity with someone in the course that's experiencing this along with you to provide some feedback in addition to what you're getting from me. Session 6, that's crunch time. By session 5 and 6, you should be ready and collecting your data. You should be implementing your project. You should be collecting your data. One of the things that's unique about this semester, of course, is where each of our districts and schools are at with students coming back or potentially starting the year or the semester in a remote learning mode or a hybrid mode. I will not be opposed if we have multiple projects that are similar and we do have some collaborative teams that maybe look at answering the same question, just because we're in a really unique time and there's a really rich opportunity to do some action research as we're all starting to do something that may potentially be new for all of us this year. So keep me in touch. And again, if anybody wants to pop into office hours on Tuesday evening at 8 to talk about the possibility of maybe collaborating on a research topic, I'll try and do my best to link people up and throw out opportunities and help be a communicator across the group if there's interest there. So keep that in mind. But weeks 4, 5, 6, we should be ready to be doing something, taking action, and then starting to collect some data. So that in week 6, we're starting to write up the data and the data analysis that we have. And then in week 7, those last sections of the project will flow pretty quickly because you're just going to summarize. You're going to write about your results and conclusions and how you're going to share your plans with others. So take a breath. I know that there's a lot on everybody's plates right now and it's a stressful time like no other, but just know that this is doable, it's manageable. We're going to take one bite at a time each week, and I'm going to be providing you feedback as we go. So this is a longer screencast. I was trying to condense it down and I'm right on the same amount of time as my past ones, so at least I'm consistent. There's a data measure right there. I'm going to sign off, but know that I'm your resource. I am here. You can reach out to me, email me, text me, jump on Zoom at 8 o'clock on Tuesday night, and we'll talk through any concerns that you have or any questions or brainstorms that we need to do to get you moving forward. Have a great week, researchers. I'm signing off.